Your hand reaches for the bill before the waiter even sets it down. You do this every time. You have always done this. You say yes before anyone finishes asking. You apologize when someone bumps into you. You drive 20 minutes out of your way because a colleague needed a ride, and then you feel guilty for minding. You are not weak. You are not a pushover. The people around you have told you your whole life that you are one of the good ones. And you still end up holding the tab. Here is what nobody tells you about that. The pattern is not random. It is not bad luck. The specific way you think about other people is doing most of the work, and it has been doing it your entire adult life without you noticing. The question is not whether it happens. The question is why people built exactly like you were always the ones it happens. The answer starts somewhere you would not expect, not in your character, not in your childhood. In a number in 1975 at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a social psychologist named Shalom Schwartz began mapping what he called value priorities across cultures. He was not interested in good people versus bad people. He was interested in the internal architecture of decision-making, what someone weights against what in the fraction of a second before they choose. He found that people who rank other people's welfareable cog their own personal achievement share one measurable cognitive habit. They are dramatically faster at reading distress in another person's face than they are at recognizing it in a mirror. The delay is small, around 200 milliseconds, but it means they have already begun to respond to someone else's discomfort before they have finished registering their own. 200 milliseconds is enough to close the door on the choice. That is not a character flaw. That is a feature running correctly in the wrong environment in every social species that survived long enough to leave a fossil record. Individuals who respond rapidly to signals of distress in their group outlive those who wait. A slower response in a small tribe on a hostile landscape is not a philosophical position. It is a gap in the perimeter, so the response got faster across generations in the people whose tribes made it through. What you carry is not weakness. It is the inheritance of every ancestor who read a face quickly enough to matter. But inheritance does not come with an instruction manual. The same speed that made your great-great-grandmother useful in a crisis makes you apologize when someone else spills their drink. It makes you feel briefly that the discomfort of saying no is more urgent than the cost of saying yes. It makes other people's emotional states arrive in your body before your own conclusions do. And some people figured out how to use that, not through any coordinated conspiracy, through something much quieter, ordinary trial and error, repeated across millions of interactions over decades. This is where a specific sequence of moves enters the picture. In 1966, two Stanford psychologists, Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, ran a series of house-to-house visits in a California neighborhood. They started with a small ask, "Would you display a small road safety sign in your window?" Almost everyone said yes. The sign was small, the request was easy. 2 weeks later, they returned with a second request. Would you allow a large billboard to be installed in your front yard? In a control group where people received only the second request, around 17% agreed. And the group that had first said yes to the small sign, 76% agreed to the billboard. Same neighborhood, same people. The only difference was that one group had already said yes once. Friedman and Fraser called it the foot in the doors technique. But what they were actually measuring was something more precise. The way a small yes recalibrates who you understand yourself to be. Once you have agreed to something, your sense of identity begins to organize itself around that agreement. Saying no to the next request doesn't feel like protecting your time. It feels like contradicting yourself. And the faster you are at reading other people's distress, the more intensely you feel that contradiction. So here's the sequence that plays out over and over in workplaces and families and friendships. A small request arrives. It costs you something you can afford. You say yes. A second request arrives slightly larger. You have already said yes once, so no feels like a reversal. By the third or fourth request, you are not making a decision anymore. You are maintaining a self-image. The cost has stopped being visible because the comparison point has shifted. This is not manipulation in the dramatic sense. It rarely involves anyone who thinks of themselves as a manipulator. Which brings you to the part that is genuinely hard to hold. In 1995, a research psychologist named Dasher Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley began what became a 15-year study of how power changes behavior. He brought strangers into a lab and randomly assigned some of them to feel temporarily powerful through simple writing exercises. Then he ran them through a series of tasks involving other people's needs. The results held up across every variation he tested. People in the temporary high-power condition were measurably worse at reading other people's faces. They interrupted more. They took resources from a shared pile without checking if others needed them. They did not do this because they were cruel. They did it because power, even fake power that lasts 40 minutes, narrows the field of attention. It makes the self louder and everything else quieter. So the same cognitive machinery that makes you fast at reading distress also keeps you out of positions where that skill stops mattering. You are not drawn to people who do not need you. You are drawn to people who need you because that is where you feel useful, and useful feels like belonging. The people most likely to need you visibly and repeatedly are people for whom the cost of needing is low. For some of them, it is low because they have never had to pay it. For others, because they learned early that someone like you would absorb it. None of this makes them villains. This is the part where most explanations stop because the next step is uncomfortable. The people who most reliably take from people like you are not, in any simple sense, different from you. In 1979, at the University of British Columbia, psychologist Robert Hare began developing the most widely used clinical assessment of callous, antisocial behavior. But in 20 years of work, Hare noted something that rarely makes it into popular accounts. The majority of people who repeatedly take advantage of others in ordinary life, in marriages, workplaces, families, do not score high on his scale. They are not disordered. They are ordinary people who have learned through nothing more dramatic than experience that the people around them will absorb cost without complaint. They are not exploiting a weakness. They are responding to a signal. You absorb cost without complaint. That is not a flaw. But it is a signal. Here is where the logic seems to close shut. The mechanism is real, the pattern is documented, and the direction of flow is one way. The responsible thing, it would appear, is to become less reliably available, less fast to say yes, become harder, and the signal changes. That is where the research stops agreeing. In 2012, organizational psychologist Adam Grant at the Wharton School published the results of a decade tracking thousands of professionals across engineering, medicine, and sales. He was looking for what separated the bottom performers from the top. The bottom of every sample was dominated by people who gave more than they received. But so was the top. The very highest performers across all three fields were also the ones most willing to contribute without expectation of return. The difference between the ones at the bottom and the ones at the top was not how much they gave. It was whether they had learned to distinguish between a request that cost them and one that didn't. The people who tried to stop being givers, who became more guarded and transactional, did not move to the top. They moved to the middle. They lost the thing that made them effective without gaining the discrimination that would have protected them. You cannot fix this by becoming someone else. What the full body of research points toward is narrower and more precise. In 1991, developmental psychologist Nancy Eisenberg at Arizona State University published work showing that high-empathy individuals who experience distress that originates in someone else's state are measurably more prone to compliance under social pressure. But she also found that this effect could be modulated by a single variable, the presence of a stable internal reference point for their own state, not a rule, not a resolution. A question asked in the moment, what do I actually feel about this? Not what should I feel? Not what does this person need? What am I carrying right now before I answer? The delay that buys you that question is around 2 seconds. The same 200 milliseconds that closes the door can be stretched, not easily, not automatically, but deliberately with practice until the new pattern runs before the thinking starts. You are not going to become someone who reads rooms more slowly. That is not on the table, but you can become someone who reads their own room first. The people who learned to do this did not stop being generous. The giving did not shrink. What changed is that it arrived differently, not as a response to pressure, but as a decision made in the one moment between the distress signal landing and the yes escaping. That gap is not a wall. It is a threshold. Your instinct was never the problem. It was built in a world where being fast to respond to others kept you alive, and it still has that function. What was never built because it was not needed in that world was a mechanism for distinguishing between a request that serves the group and a request that simply serves the person making it. That distinction is not innate. It is learned, and the learning is not about becoming harder, it is about becoming more precise. You did not end up holding the bill because you are too good. You ended up holding it because the system around you adjusted to a gap you left open without knowing it was there. The gap is still there. Now you can see it.